All right, welcome back, everyone. This is going to be Macroeconomics, Chapter 13. And this time we're going to shift from the demand side, the Keynesian perspective of economics, the sort of recessionary, short-term economics, to the neoclassical, long-term supply-side economics. Okay? So, remember that we're building on the philosophy and the theories of Say. And so we discussed this in Chapter 11. Yeah, Chapter 11. Now we're just breaking out the concept even further. All right? So we hit Keynesian economics last time. We will hit the other side of the free market economic philosophies this time. And then the next chapter will be Karl Marx and Engels' The Communist Manifesto. Okay? All right, so pause me, pull out your notes, and we will get going. Section 13.1, the building blocks of neoclassical analysis. Now, we've already touched on a lot of the concepts and all of this stuff, so this chapter is going to be a little bit shorter because a lot of it is just the Keynesian response to, and we've already touched on a lot of the philosophies of. So what I'd really like to do is just walk you through the main argumentation. It's a really complicated argument. But I think once you actually, once I walk you through it step by step, it's really easy to understand, and you'll go, "Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense." It's really complicated in the graphics and the explanation, but it makes a logical sense. It's just a very logical pathway from one thing to another. So we'll walk through it so that you have a really deep understanding of at least the basic philosophy of neoclassical economic thought. Okay, again, these are the assumptions of Say, and the two major assumptions of the supply-side economics, or neoclassicism, neoclassicalism, are that first, the potential GDP in the system determines the size of the economy. And so it's all about the LRAS, the long-run... Man, I just went blank. The long-run aggregate supply model, okay? So the LRAS is what drives everything here, whereas in the Keynesian perspective and the Keynesian models, everything was about demand and how demand can push supply. This time it's about how supply is locked in. We are assumed this is the production possibilities frontier curve. We are at 100%. This is where we can be. This is our LRAS. We cannot move it or change it in any way. Growth or declination of the economy can shift the LRAS line over time. But right now, in this moment, this is our maximum capacity, okay? Our LRAS vertical line. And that is figure 13.3, and we'll talk about sort of how that works and the implications of a stable LRAS. All right. The first is that GDP determines the economy size, all right? So that's the first assumption of the neoclassical perspective. It's all about the LRAS. The second is that wages and prices adjust in a flexible manner so that the economy adjusts back to its potential GDP level. All right. So no matter what happens in the economy, no matter what happens to the demand curve in the economy, and even the short run aggregate supply curve, the SRAS, regardless of what happens with those, they always come back to the vertical LRAS, all right, the long-run aggregate supply line. So these are the two very basic building blocks of the neoclassical model. Okay. I would just note that potential GDP and real GDP are different. Real GDP is the actual measure. Potential GDP is like the 100% theoretical. If we were producing perfectly on the production possibilities frontier curve at 100%, no more, no less, then we would be at our potential GDP. And you can see that real GDP almost perfectly tracks potential GDP over time. It's a pretty stable marker. Again, we talked about the LRAS. The implications of this are that eventually all that can happen in the broader economy are effects on inflation, pricing levels, and unemployment. But it's all about inflation levels, how adjustments in the demand curves and adjustments in the short run aggregate supply curve affect inflation, the pricing levels in the system. All right, and so now we're going to track down to figure 13.4. There's a whole lot going on here, and so I'm going to walk you through it step by step. I tried to write it out as explicitly as I can because this is one of the things that really trips up a lot of my former students is this this supply side theoretical underpinnings of how the supply side argument works and what the inevitable adjustments to the assumption that the LRAS is vertical and stable are. Okay? So again, if we're looking at this, the y-axis is your price levels. This is the inflation rate, sort of how it will lead to the inflation rate. So it's not actually the inflation rate. It is the price level of a finished product. So this determines the profitability in the system. It eventually leads to inflation levels, these sorts of things. Okay, versus the GDP, your real GDP, the actual one, not the imaginary one that we were just talking about, the potential GDP. Now we're talking about your real GDP, the actual numbers that the economists are putting out for the U.S. or whatever economy we're talking about. All right, so that's our y and our x-axis. And then you'll note, again, that your long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, and it cannot be adjusted. There is no changing this. This is under the assumptions of this model, the NeoClassical system. This always stays the same. It is vertical. You cannot change it. You can just adjust things to it, but that is your natural equilibrium point. All right. So, given all of these things, and we know that the LRAS is stable and it cannot change, what happens if we get a big pop in demand? And graphically, that would be represented from a shift from AD naught or AD 0 to the right to AD 1. So if you look at 13.4, for some reason, we were at equilibrium 0 on demand line 0, like that's our natural place. But for some reason, demand has popped. Maybe the government has injected money into the system. Maybe there's a new, technological frontier or some new crazy product that like just everyone has to have. But we've seen demand pop. And so for this market, demand shifts right to the D1 curve, and this naturally leads to an equilibrium, the new equilibrium of E1. Right? So we've shifted from E0 to E1 due to a demand pop. What happens? In the very short run, GDP increases, and you can see that it shifted from, they're saying, from 500 on the LRAS to now 525 under E1, the new equilibrium. And prices have also increased. We've gotten inflationary tendencies from E0 to E1. Price levels have shot up from 120 to 125. Okay. Now, what are the effects of that shift? The effect is that the labor market is now hot, right? Companies want to produce more at 125 price level. Unfortunately, the economy is already at its natural unemployment rate when we're on the LRAS, and so what happens is labor starts to become short and difficult to come by, wages increase, and the firms in the market are having to spend a greater portion of their relative spending on labor and wages, which takes away from your relative output. That makes sense? And so what happens is you shift from E1 to E2. Now, prices have increased, wages are increased, the cost of labor, which is a price, and you have now shifted back to the long run aggregate supply curve. And instead of getting a pop in GDP, we've now adjusted back because we're producing fewer goods because we're having to spend a relatively greater amount on wages and labor. And so it shrinks back to 500. But now we see the eventual end term effect is that we get inflation. So the labor market eventually is unaffected. Our GDP eventually is unaffected. What is affected is the cost of goods. The price index increases. And so all we've done is get inflation in our system. Right? So this is the main philosophy of Say's and the main philosophy of the neoclassical economist. All right, so that's a lot, right? I would say go back, read through the notes, and listen to the lecture, or just read through the notes step by step and try to conceptualize these shifts in your head. All right? Like I said, I tried to make it as explicit as I could in the notes. I know sometimes it's really hard to follow in the textbooks because they want to make points about this or that, but if you just follow it through, it should walk you through exactly what is happening and exactly what the philosophical and assumptions of the neoclassical argument are. And I would also say, if you flip that and you see an instant reduction in demand, as we see in recessionary tendencies and in depressions, we just get the exact opposite tendency. Prices decrease, which is called deflation. Now people are able to spend more, but wages cost less because prices decrease and wages are just the price of labor. Wages should be dropping. And we get deflationary tendencies. You get a slight shift downward in your GDP, but eventually what happens, just like in the opposite side, what happens is that you cut out your extra dead wood in your inflation, in your employment market, and then eventually, because you're spending relatively less on labor, you're able to produce more, and you're able to get more profits out of the market, and then eventually it shifts back to the long-run aggregate supply curve, and you get deflation in the market. And then this deflation and the lesser cost of products in the market eventually leads to greater demand because people are having to spend a smaller proportion of their income on a particular good or all goods generally, and so you eventually get more and more demand, and it shifts you back to the LRAS curve, but with the LRAS vertical, because it's not really a curve. They call them curves, but in this sense, in this assumption, it's not a curve. But you get back to the LRAS vertical line, but now you have deflation in the system, and you've come to a natural resting place once again after a recession or a depression. All right. Okay, there's a lot here. I would also say some of the assumptions of economists and some of the assumptions of the models of the statistics and the theoretical models, there are problems with them, and we've talked about these before, but I would here talk about rational expectations. A lot of economists and a lot of economic models assume that there are rational expectations in the model. I mean, in each purchaser, and that each purchaser and the suppliers in the market all act perfectly rational. They all have collected all of the information that exists in the system, and they're making perfect decisions. Clearly, that's not how things work, right? And we don't get instantaneous adjustments. It's not how the human mind works. And so there are attempts at ameliorating some of these issues through the new adaptive expectations models. And this in statistics is generally done through a system called Bayesian updating. And it basically tracks standard deviations over different patternings of data. I won't go into the deeper statistical details, but really cool stuff. But it also has its problems because, say with the housing market in 2008, the assumption, and the proper assumption given all expectations and all of the data that existed prior to, said that the housing market is a sure bet and that if you just keep snatching up property, it is a 100% guaranteed return on money, right? That's not how things work in reality. But Bayesian statistics and Bayesian updating until basically just before the collapse, and even the human mind, right? Bayesian updating is only supposed to be an approximation of how humans think, and so in the same way that Bayesian statistics have problems, human brains have problems, right? They over generate evidence that they want to see. They offer emphasis to other evidence that they've seen before, just because they haven't seen something different. Even if other phenomena exist, they will discount them because they haven't experienced them or seen them. These sorts of things. There are wiring and adaptive problems with the way that the human brain is built, and so. In the same sense, we have problems with the statistical models and trying to theorize how these things work. Now, should we stop trying? Absolutely not, right? It gets better and better and better. We're not doing simple, multiplicative regressions at this point. We're doing like crazy neural networking and Bayesian statistics analysis and these sorts of things. And we're still in the infancy of statistics and mathematical computation and these sorts of things. So it'll get better over time. And it has, because originally it was just rational expectations, right? All humans have all information and they make perfect decisions all the time. BS. That's not a really good assumption, right? But even under those assumptions, we can learn things about theoretical and foundational underpinnings in human behavior and things like that. So the idea is learn what you can, use what you can to learn what you can, but make it better as you go, which is one of the wonderful things of science. So, okay, so the policy implications. Excuse me, man, I've got a little tickle. The policy implications of the neoclassical perspective. The policy perspectives of the neoclassical, at least the hardcore neoclassical, would say that government intervention is unneeded, unnecessary, unwanted, and even detrimental sometimes. Why would they suggest this? Under the theoretical assumptions of the supply side economics, the LRAS is unchangeable, right? The long run aggregate supply line is what it is. And so nothing you do can actually change that. And under the very simple tenets of this brilliant theory that has its problems, we'll get to, but it really is quite brilliant. Under the assumptions of this theoretical idea, the economy naturally adjusts itself to the LRAS. And I think that most economists would say that the average recession only lasts maybe 9 months to 15 months. The average. Remember, we've talked about the problems with the average as a measure, but it is a measure, and it tells you something. And so the average recessionary period is only about 12 to 15 months. And if you really think about how difficult it is to measure, first of all, that you are in a recession, and then to get politicians and policymakers to come together to argue about what should be implemented, and then get the executive branch to actually implement those changes, and then get the firms and the human individuals to get either the money or the tax breaks or whatever it is, and then for that money to have an effect on the system is a really long-term problem. And they have a point. Now, I would also say that, remember, a lot of what we've been talking about is based on beliefs. We've touched on quite a few times. It's about the belief about the potential in the future. Like, do I think our economy is going to completely collapse and that I should dig a hole and start, collecting canned goods? And in some sense, the long-term planning that it takes for economists to measure, and then politicians to argue about, and then to implement in the executive system, and then to get into your hands, it's all part of that game, right? It's that part of like convincing everyone in the economy that things are going to be okay, that we see it, we're tracking it, we're doing something about it, and so just hang in there. Everything's going to be cool, That's, I think, as much a part of the Keynesian side's argument as the difficulty and the time consumed of putting these things into place. So, right, remember there's a balance, right? It does take a long time, and maybe you are not actually having much of an effect, but maybe you're saving jobs that could have been lost because people believe that help is coming, okay? So remember, always try to think about things both ways and have an open mind. But the supply side theory is pretty brilliant. It basically just says that, like, if you get unemployment and a recession, prices are naturally going to drop, and people are going to have to pay less for goods, and that's going to stimulate demand, and eventually it's going to pick you back up to the LRAS, right? And if things get way too hot and your economy's burning out of control, and eventually what will happen is that unemployment will be extraordinarily low, and it'll be so low that it'll be difficult for firms to be able to purchase labor, and so wages will be driven up. It'll push you back onto the LRAS, and you will just have inflation rather than the deflation of the opposite of what I just said. So really cool natural tendencies in these markets to just fix themselves, which is probably the most brilliant part of Say's law and the supply side, is that man, this is really complicated, but it's cool that the economy sort of has the invisible hand, right? That sort of fixes itself, at least in the long term. Again, we talked about time. I would also talk about, we talked about the average of a recession or a depression is 1 year, 12 to 15 months or so. That doesn't mean that the real ones, that the supply side would work in any real timely manner. And that I think that Keynesians and even the supply side people would say, look, if we can stimulate it, even if it does cause some inflation, it's good to get people back to work, and then maybe you can stimulate it better so we can get to that LRAS eventually. But when you're in the really deep recessions or the Great Depression, at that point you're so far from reaching the LRAS. As we saw on the sort of the multiplicative model, where you can see the Keynesian, the intermediate, and then the neoclassical, you're so far down into the Keynesian, even from just the Keynesian perspective, and even from this perspective, there's so much unemployment in the system that maybe it'd be okay to cause a little bit of inflation if that can boost demand. All right. All right, that's it. This was a pretty good. I would say read the thesis, and I sort of, man, they were really bad about in this book the tables. They'll split them between 2 or 3 pages. So I tried to just shrink everything down to one table, because it really is just one table, so that you can see all of the different minute variations that can be discussed, and the changes that can be discussed between these two models. I would say read the thesis. I would also say neoclassicalism is a long-term model, and it doesn't really work in the short term, and that the invisible hand isn't as great as people think it is. And inflation isn't as real as people think it is, obviously, as we've seen in this course, and as the data points out, there are no real inflationary tendencies in a modern society, or in a modern economy, a developed economy. So a lot of this is sort of by the wayside. There is some cool stuff to be seen and to be learned about the natural tendencies of the market to adjust itself. There are some cool things to be learned about, what would happen under the assumption of a stable LRAS. But inflationary tendencies, again, we haven't seen them in 65 years. So I don't know how applicable this always is. It's got serious problems that neoclassical economists are still trying to adjust. So it works in the macro scale from a chronal perspective, right? It works on a 20 to 30 to 40 year time scale. We should be investing in there's no way to bolster our economy, to grow our GDP, until you shift the LRAS. That's also an assumption under the neoclassical model, right? And so under that assumption, we should be spending billions upon billions, or maybe trillions of dollars investing in human capital, infrastructure, productive techniques, scientific techniques and developments, so that we can push the LRAS further and further and further, because there's nothing we can do without that. Because we're already at our frontier. There's nothing that the government can do to boost demand, according to this argument, which obviously is not true. But so even under the assumptions of this, we should be collecting lots of taxes and investing in research. In research and development and in technological advances, so that we can push that LRAS further and further out. So some really interesting implications under the supply side economics. Anyway, I'll have the next one out, Karl Marx, probably either tonight or in the morning. Everybody stay happy and healthy. Thanks for sticking with me, and have a great day. Bye.